Welcome to the Claire and Horatio Daily World Brief, available at claireandhoratio.com. Imagine sitting in your apartment on a Sunday night, the walls are shaking, the windows are shattering, and you suddenly realize your city's defense systems they're completely empty.
That was the terrifying reality for residents of Kyiv over the weekend because, as the Ukrainian Air Force admitted, out of 23 incoming Russian ballistic missiles, not a single one was shot down. Zero.
Which is a terrifying statistic. They cited a serious shortage of interceptor missiles, even as that broader weekend attack involved 68 missiles and over 350 drones, leaving at least 15 people dead in Kyiv and 8 more in the wider region.
The mechanical failure of that defense grid is exactly what Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is bringing to the NATO summit in Ankara, Turkey on Tuesday. He's issuing a stark, mathematically grounded warning to allies regarding those shortages.
A warning that Moscow will basically keep hitting residential buildings as long as defensive Patriot missiles remain sitting in the stockpiles of Western allies. Elena, a Kiev resident who survived the attack, asked a very direct question. Where are our partners?
That question cuts right to the core tension in military doctrine right now. National leaders are constantly weighing the obligation to protect their own borders against the moral and strategic imperative to support an ally under active bombardment.
But let me pause you right there to understand the actual mechanics of this. Because if the U.S. and Western allies possess these Patriot interceptors, what is the holdup? Are we talking about a logistical nightmare to transport them? Or is this a deliberate policy choice to keep their silos full for some hypothetical future conflict?
It is predominantly the latter. When a nation depletes its own defensive reserves to arm an ally, military planners have to recalculate their own domestic vulnerability. A Patriot missile system isn't something you can just, manufacture overnight on an assembly line.
Right. They are incredibly complex, expensive pieces of technology with years-long procurement cycles.
Exactly. So defense ministries look at their stockpiles and, well, they establish a minimum threshold required for their own national security, which is often tied to NATO mutual defense obligations. What we're witnessing is the friction between immediate, catastrophic humanitarian necessity in Kyiv and the long-term bureaucratic security doctrines of Western capitals.
And the human toll of that bureaucratic friction is just devastating. Relief agencies are severely questioning the moral math here, basically asking how governments can justify hoarding stockpiles while apartment blocks in an allied nation are actively collapsing. That calculation seemed to be forcing a massive realignment in how nations manage their checkbooks.
That is precisely what we're seeing unfold in Germany ahead of the Ankara summit. The German government is fundamentally restructuring its national priorities in response to this exact geopolitical fragility. Chancellor Friedrich Merz's cabinet just approved the draft 2027 budget, and it represents a massive structural pivot.
A pivot that includes increasing defense spending by a full one-third, bringing their total to nearly $126 billion. Looking at the highlighted sections of the source material regarding this budget, I'm really trying to wrap my head around the geopolitical maneuvering here.
Well, the maneuvering is very pointed. Merz personally placed a call to U.S. President Donald Trump on Friday to correct what he called outdated claims about German defense spending, making sure Washington knows Germany is aiming to spend 3.5% of its GDP on defense by 2029.
Which coincides with Canada reportedly bypassing South Korea to buy 12 submarines directly from a German shipbuilder. That move is explicitly designed to bind Ottawa closer to Europe, creating distance from what they view as a volatile administration in Washington. But coming back to Germany's internal numbers, where does a massive influx of cash like that physically come from in a country historically known for strict fiscal rules?
It requires breaking deeply ingrained financial habits. The German government is planning to borrow heavily over $200 billion to repair infrastructure and modernize the military. But the most consequential mechanism funding this buildup is a severe extraction of resources from the foreign aid sector.
Yeah, they are aggressively slashing their humanitarian aid down to $1 billion and their development aid down to $11 billion. This isn't just a slight trim, it is a structural retreat from global development.
And the pushback on that from civil society is intense. Relief organizations, specifically Terre de Hum and Welthungerhilfe, are issuing devastating warnings. They argue that slashing humanitarian funding to build submarines and buy weapons is a dangerous miscalculation of what actually creates stability.
They're asking a vital question, which is, does abandoning the global south to fund a domestic military buildup actually make the world safer, Or does it simply create vast vacuums of influence and guarantee more suffering down the line?
The mechanism of cause and effect here is exactly what those organizations are trying to highlight. The traditional assumption in defense circles is that hard power weapons, submarines, interceptor missiles provide security. But the counter argument is that true security requires addressing the root causes of conflict, which are overwhelmingly economic and humanitarian.
Because if a major economic engine like Germany pulls the safety nets out from vulnerable regions, you trigger a chain reaction. Agricultural programs fail, local economies collapse, and you end up dealing with the fallout in the form of regional wars or massive forced migration.
Precisely. They are arguing that cutting development aid now simply ensures you will need more military spending later to manage the resulting chaos. It's a reactionary cycle.
And that German pivot is a great example of a nation changing its behavior because the established international system feels entirely unreliable right now. Honestly, looking at the documents we have regarding the U.S. executive branch's interaction with global institutions, it's hard not to see why nations are circling the wagons.
You're referring to the highly revealing story unfolding about institutional integrity, centered on the World Cup match against Belgium taking place on Tuesday. The situation with U.S. striker Folarin Balogun perfectly illustrates the fragility of these international frameworks.
Right, because Balogun received a red card and an automatic one-match suspension, rendering him ineligible for this upcoming round of 16 match. In the architecture of international sports, a red card is supposed to be a non-negotiable regulatory mechanism.
Until it isn't, because President Trump publicly confirmed he placed a call directly to FIFA President Gianni Infantino to demand a review of the suspension. And in a move that completely shocked the sports world, FIFA partially suspended the ban for 12 months, effectively rewriting their own enforcement protocol to allow Balogun to play.
The mechanics of how FIFA justified this are incredibly murky too. They cited some obscure article in their disciplinary code regarding probationary periods, but the lack of a specific, transparent explanation has thrown the integrity of the entire tournament into question. The Belgian Football Association protested the eligibility immediately.
And the international reaction didn't stop there. Incoming German national team coach Jürgen Klopp called the interference madness, while England manager Thomas Tuchel warned of a dangerous precedent. He questioned the fundamental utility of a rulebook if it can simply be overridden by executive pressure from a head of state.
For more daily briefings, brain candy explainers, and classic audiobooks, visit clarinaratio.com. I mean, if a head of state can successfully pressure a supposedly independent global governing body to change its rules for a single soccer match, it exposes a profound weakness. We're looking at a system where the rules apply rigidly to everyone except those with enough political leverage to bypass them entirely.
Contextualizing this historically shows just how irregular this reversal is. Of the nearly 200 red cards issued in World Cup history, the only other time a suspension was effectively bypassed was for Brazil's Garrincha back in 1962, which was heavily shrouded in rumors of political interference from the Brazilian government.
Because sports governing bodies are purposefully designed with firewalls to insulate them from national politics. The entire premise of fair competition relies on that insulation. So when a regulatory body folds under the weight of focused executive pressure, it ceases to be a neutral arbiter and becomes a vehicle for geopolitical soft power.
It is fascinating to see how executive power manipulates the rules in public spaces like sports, while entirely different strategies are deployed behind closed doors when it comes to hard power. Moving to the situation in Tehran, the aftermath of an assassination ordered by the U.S. and Israel 4 months ago is a prime example of this duality.
The imagery from the weekend is staggering. Millions of Iranians filled the streets of Tehran for the funeral procession of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. It was a 6-mile procession, black flags everywhere, furious demands for vengeance, and effigies of Donald Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu burning in the streets. It's a massive display of state-sanctioned mourning.
Yet, amidst that massive projection of public strength, there's a glaring vulnerability. Mojtaba Khamenei, the son and presumed successor to the supreme leader, has not been seen in public since the February 28th strike that killed his father. He didn't even appear beside his brothers as they prayed over the coffin.
Which is wild because he's been communicating strictly through written statements. In an authoritarian system, physical presence during succession is a critical mechanism of projecting control. His absence suggests profound internal security concerns or potential power struggles within the state apparatus, contradicting the unified front they are displaying to the cameras.
And how governments navigate this kind of internal crisis requires incredible compartmentalization. You have the public squares filled with anti-Western rhetoric and absolute resistance, but behind closed doors, a completely different reality is dictating their actions. Negotiators for the U.S. and Iran, meeting in Doha, have just signed a preliminary agreement to end the war and reopen the Strait of Hormuz.
The mechanics of reopening that waterway translate instantly into public consequences across the globe. I mean, the Strait of Hormuz is the bottleneck for roughly 20% of the world's global oil and gas shipments. When a shipping lane like that is mined or threatened, maritime insurance adjusters immediately calculate the risk of a tanker being destroyed.
And those insurance premiums skyrocket, which the shipping companies pass to the energy providers, who then pass it directly into the inflation numbers affecting household budgets and grocery bills worldwide. Resolving this bottleneck is an absolute economic necessity.
Interestingly, the financial burden of those naval mines is causing severe friction, even among allies. The German foreign minister, Johann Wadephul, has demanded that Iran foot the bill for the European mission required to clear the estimated 80 naval mines from the strait.
His argument being that Tehran unlawfully mined an international shipping lane and the European taxpayers shouldn't have to subsidize the cleanup. It is a fascinating look at the financial mechanics of conflict resolution, revealing the intense economic pressure forcing both sides to the table in Doha.
The Iranian leadership is acutely aware that prolonged closure of the strait isolates them further and accelerates internal economic collapse. It's like watching a high-stakes corporate bankruptcy negotiation happening quietly in the boardroom, while out on the balcony, the CEO is telling the employees they are about to take over the world.
A government feeds its populace a continuous narrative of unyielding resistance against foreign enemies, while its diplomats quietly sign paperwork just to ensure the state's economic survival. The public is given the theater of war, while the leadership is forced to acknowledge the physical and economic limits of their power.
But while politicians are negotiating borders, succession, and truces in Doha or Ankara, the physical realities of the planet are indiscriminately punishing civilian populations, entirely outside of any negotiated rules-based order. Over the weekend, severe weather events caused immense devastation.
In southern China, Typhoon Maisak killed 2 people in Guangxi province and forced the immediate evacuation of 48,000 residents as reservoirs overflowed, completely submerging construction sites and local infrastructure.
The human impact is just brutal. Meanwhile, in India, punishing monsoon rains triggered the collapse of a building in a Mumbai slum on Sunday. 6 people were killed, including 5 children, as the city faced severe landslides. We are watching the physical reality of the climate crisis destroy homes and take lives in real time.
Yet the investigation into the UK media landscape highlights a massive, highly incentivized disconnect in how this physical reality is reported to the public. The financial mechanisms detailed in the reporting are striking. Paul Marshall, the hedge fund billionaire and co-owner of the UK's GB News network, nearly tripled his firm's investments in fossil fuel giants like Chevron and Shell during the first quarter of 2026.
According to the data, his fund's fossil fuel investments reached a staggering $2.8 billion. The civic stakes of that financial maneuver are deeply concerning when you examine the output of the media properties he controls. During the recent election period, GB News broadcast nearly 1,000 attacks on climate science and climate action.
And Marshall himself has previously gone on record calling the human impact on global heating a subject that is still, quote, up for debate. The investigation raises a massive red flag about conflict of interest, exposing a profound moral hazard at the center of the information ecosystem.
Because the public relies on independent journalism to understand the severity and mechanics of global threats, like the ones causing reservoirs to overflow in Guangxi or slums to collapse in Mumbai. But that independence is structurally compromised if the ownership of the network profits directly, to the tune of billions of dollars from the very industries driving the crisis.
When the financial incentive is aligned with denying the physical reality, the information provided to the public becomes fundamentally skewed. It creates a dangerous feedback loop where policy delays are manufactured by the very people profiting from the status quo.
It is exactly like finding out your town's fire chief has personally invested millions of dollars into an arson syndicate, all while using the public address system to tell the residents that the smoke filling their living rooms is just a natural weather event. If the broadcaster profits from the flames, the emergency broadcast itself becomes a mechanism of harm.
Synthesizing these events reveals a distinct pattern regarding the evasion of accountability. In Kyiv, we see the lethal consequences when nations prioritize their internal bureaucratic defense rules over protecting a civilian population under active bombardment.
And in the sports world, FIFA's willingness to override its own regulatory code under pressure from a head of state exposes how easily institutions fold when confronted by executive power.
While in the media landscape, the influx of billions into fossil fuels by owners of networks broadcasting climate denial demonstrates the danger of having the narrative controlled by those with a vested interest in the problem. The insulation that is supposed to protect the public from these conflicts of interest is failing across the board.
The policies, the political maneuvering, and the hedge fund portfolios we've analyzed today all eventually trickle down to physical, tangible consequences for populations who have zero say in the backroom negotiations. As global institutions, whether they manage military alliances, international sports, or the climate narrative continue to bend to individual political and financial pressure, it leaves a glaring question for you to ponder. When the rules no longer apply to those at the top, who's actually left to advocate for the civilians caught in the crossfire? Thank you for your time today. We invite you to visit clarinhoratio.com for more daily world briefs and deep context brain candy explainers.